report. I actually attended that launch today, and some very groundbreaking research that shows that we are still not secure enough, especially when it comes to companies being able to be proactive in terms of sensing threats and reacting to the threats. So it's a big conversation that continues. And we want to cross over now to the United Kingdom, where we have Paul Gabriel, who is one of the key minds when it comes to the African issues around control and risks. And it is afternoon here in Kenya. I don't know, what time is it back home, Paul?
It's afternoon as well.
All right. So let's just dive into this conversation around Africa. I do know that Control Risks did release an index, and just walk us through some of the key highlights and your thoughts as well on the threats that face the continent around cybercrime.
Sure. So the index is the Africa Risk and Reward Index. And what we've done is we've looked at both the risks that companies that invest in Africa face, as well as some of the rewards that they can obtain. And many indices already exist that look only at the risk or that only look at the opportunity. But this is an index that really tries to combine the two sides into one overall assessment. And the key findings from that assessment are that, yes, of course, you have the big African economies like Egypt, like Nigeria, like South Africa. But for various reasons, all of these three big economies face challenges. In South Africa, at the moment, we have political issues. In Nigeria, we have the low oil price.
Yes.
And instead, if you look at East Africa, Kenya and Ethiopia in particular stand out as really interesting destinations for foreign investors to invest. Because, yes, there are risks at the moment, especially in Kenya with the re-election, or in Ethiopia with some of the social unrest that we've seen. But
Sure.
there also are very many opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And you've touched on a number of interesting issues, especially that South Africa is actually going through a major sort of turbulence. And what does this mean for Kenya? Because Kenya is also looking towards going to the elections. Will this have any impact really on the economy and, of course, on the investor sentiment, even as we prepare for the polls?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in Kenya, what we are seeing when we're speaking to investors at the moment is that investors are still very keen to come into Kenya and to invest money in the country. Mm-hmm. But for the moment, investors are holding back making decisions. They want to see first how are the elections going and who is going to win in the elections. And then after this has been settled, they're very happy to come and actually invest in the country. So the main implication from the elections at the moment is simply that investors are holding back. They're currently suspending some of the decisions that they would otherwise make to wait until the re-election is over and then commit their investments to the country. So I don't think it's a longer-term implication, but for the moment, we always see some pause.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of scenarios can we draw out of the upcoming elections? Of course, the political climate is a bit tense right now, bearing in mind that some key reforms are yet to be effected, that the opposition candidates have been fronting to the electoral body. What sort of scenarios should we also be prepared for in the eventuality that we don't have an election, as the opposition leader has continued to maintain he will only take part in an election that is meeting the threshold that goes by his irreducible minimums?
Yes, so of course we have the Supreme Court ruling, and that means that holding a new election is somewhat more difficult because we now have all these additional criteria that the new rerun of the election will have to meet. But whilst it's understandable that everyone in Kenya is very focused on the elections at the moment, regardless of the outcome, the overall future of the country and the economic prospects for the country are very positive. And that's something when we speak to investors that we emphasize and that we hear from those companies as well, that whilst at the moment everything seems somewhat uncertain and we don't quite know who is going to win or what exactly that will mean for the country, but if you look at the fundamentals, if you look at the diversity of the Kenyan economy, if you look at the growth prospects, if you look at the structure of the economy, if you look at the fact that Kenya has so many young people, in the future, that means it's all very positive factors that even though we might have some risks at the moment and going forward as well, the opportunity side, and that's where we come back to the index, the opportunity side as we measure it in Kenya is particularly good. And that's, I think, what's going to drive investment into the country going forward as well.
All right. And Gabriel, before I let you go, we've seen a number of countries trying to jostle for the space for Kenya in terms of hosting trade summits in the last few months and years. Right now we have the Kenya-French summit happening in Nairobi. Perhaps what does this signify in a time where we are seeing commodity prices is still a big conversation, and of course issues around terrorism playing out in the global stage?
Sure, yeah, I think it's an interesting time for Kenya. If you look at some of the neighboring countries, if you look at Uganda or Tanzania, who are trying at the moment, but also for at least the last 1 or 2 years, to challenge Kenya in some of its positions. And Kenya, for many years and still today, is the country that investors will come to. If a foreign company wants to invest in East Africa, it will come to Kenya in most of the cases, because Kenya is known as the business hub for the region. And countries like Uganda, countries like Tanzania are trying to challenge Kenya in that position. But none of these other countries is completely risk-free. If you just look at Tanzania and some of the challenges that especially companies in the mining sector are facing in Tanzania, that sends signals to investors that even though there's uncertainty in Kenya at the moment, all the transparency of the country and the stability of the country is still very attractive. And I think that will mean that Kenya, although it sees more competition, will still be a very, very important business hub for the region going forward.
All right, and just to get your parting shot, Gabriel, should we say that investors are right now cautiously optimistic, and where should they put their money in, which sectors?
Yes, I would say absolutely. Foreign investors are cautiously optimistic. They are waiting for the elections to be over. But I think once the elections are over, once we have a new government in place, then I think we'll see foreign investors committing to those decisions and some of those big projects moving forward. What we expect is, if you look at Kenya's debt levels, if you look at the government spending over the last 4 or 5 years, then what we expect for whoever comes into the president's office going forward, that some of the investments going into the country will slightly change. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of investment in infrastructure in particular, whereas going forward, what we expect is more companies looking at the consumer market. Kenya is very attractive in that space because you have a rising middle class, you have the consumers that can buy some of the products of international companies. So for those companies to go into Kenya, to expand, to sell their products locally is very interesting. And so I think that's what we're going to see going forward.
All right. Many thanks there, Paul Gabriel, speaking to us live from London, giving us the lowdown on where Africa is and where Kenya is when it comes to matters to do with the elections as well as investors. And he did mention that a number of investors are taking on a wait-and-see approach as Kenya prepares for the elections, which might have short-term implications, especially when it comes to matters to do with investments. Well,